Most people spend their entire spiritual life searching for something they believe is far away. Some divine state, some ultimate truth, some final enlightenment waiting at the end of the path. But the strange thing about the monad is this. The moment you truly understand what it is, the entire search collapses. Because the monad is not something you reach. It is what you already are before the search even begins. So the real question is not how do I find the monad? The real question is, how do you begin to see what has never been separate from you? Across ancient philosophy, mystical traditions, and deep contemplative insight, the monad has always pointed to the same truth. It is the absolute source of everything, the indivisible reality from which all existence emerges. Not a god sitting somewhere in the universe, not a being watching over creation, but the fundamental unity of existence itself. The monad is the one reality appearing as many. And the strange thing is, realizing the monad is not about learning something new. It is about seeing through the illusion that you were ever separate from it. So in this video, we're going to explore the first real steps toward this realization. Not as a philosophy, not as a belief, but as a shift in perception that can begin right now. Let's begin. Before realization can begin, one misunderstanding must collapse. Most people treat the monad like a spiritual object, something mystical, something distant, something sacred but unreachable. But the monad is not an object. It is the underlying reality of existence itself. Imagine the ocean. From the surface, you see waves. Each wave looks separate. One wave rises, another falls, another crashes. But every wave is made of the same water. The wave is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean, expressing itself temporarily as a form. This is the relationship between you and the monad. Your body, your mind, your personality. These are like waves. But the essence of what you are is the same reality expressing itself through countless forms. Realizing the monad begins when you stop identifying exclusively with the wave and start sensing the ocean behind it. The biggest barrier to realizing the monad is the deep belief that you are a separate self. From childhood, you are taught this is you. This is the world. You are inside your body. But look carefully. Your experience of reality is happening entirely within awareness. Every sight, every sound, every emotion. All of it appears within the same field of consciousness. The mind divides reality into pieces. Self and other, subject and object, observer and observed. But these divisions are mental constructions. In direct experience, there is only one seamless field of awareness in which everything appears. The moment you start seeing this, even faintly, the illusion of separation begins to crack. And through that crack, the light of the monad starts to reveal itself. Another obstacle to realizing the monad is the constant habit of thinking. Thought is useful for navigating the world, but thought cannot grasp the monad. Why? Because thought works through division and labels. The monad is prior to all divisions. So the realization of the monad does not come through analysis. It comes through direct seeing. This happens when the mind becomes quiet enough to observe the experience without constantly interpreting it. When you simply sit and watch your thoughts arise and pass, watch sensations appear and disappear, Watch emotions come and go. You begin to notice something profound. Everything in experience is changing. Everything is appearing and dissolving. But something is always present. The awareness in which it all happens. That silent, unchanging presence is the doorway to recognizing the monad. As perception deepens, another shift begins to happen. You start to notice that the same awareness that is present in you is present everywhere. The life behind your eyes is not fundamentally different from the life behind someone else's. The same source animates all forms. Trees, animals, people, stars, galaxies. They are all expressions of the same underlying reality. This is why the monad is often described as the one that appears as the many. Not metaphorically, but literally. Everything you see is the monad appearing as form. Every person you meet is another expression of the same reality that is looking through your eyes right now. And once this is seen clearly, compassion arises naturally. Because harming another becomes the same as harming yourself. And love becomes the natural recognition of unity. Eventually, realization teaches a simple but profound recognition. You were never separate from the monad, not even for a moment. The sense of separation was only a temporary appearance within consciousness, like a character in a dream believing it is independent. But when the dreamer awakens, the character and the dream are seen as expressions of the same mind. In the same way, when the monad is recognized, the seeker disappears. Not physically, but psychologically. The search ends because the one who is searching is seen as another appearance within the same reality. And what remains is simple. Life happening. Awareness present. Reality expressing itself freely. The monad appearing as everything, including you. So how do you begin to realize the monad? Not by chasing enlightenment, not by collecting spiritual ideas, but by looking directly at experience, seeing through the illusion of separation, and recognizing the silent awareness that has always been present behind every moment of your life. Because the truth is this: you are not a fragment trying to return to the whole. You are the whole, temporarily appearing as a person. And once this begins to be seen, the journey changes, the search softens, and reality begins to reveal itself in a completely different way. For thousands of years, philosophers have argued about the monad. Mystics have described it. Religions have hinted at it. Scholars have debated it. But almost no one tells you what the monad actually refers to. Because the moment it is truly understood, philosophy ends. Not because the mystery is solved, but because the one who is trying to solve it is no longer separate from what they were searching for. The monad is not an idea. It is what remains when every idea collapses. When people hear the word monad, they usually imagine something abstract, some ancient philosophical concept from Greek metaphysics or mystical theology. And while philosophers like Plotinus spoke about the monad as the ultimate source of all existence, the truth is far more direct than most teachings suggest. The monad is not a theory about reality. The monad is the fact of reality itself before the mind divides it into pieces. It is what exists before subject and object appear, before observer and observed, before self and world. And the reason this realization changes everything is because the monad is not something you discover out there in the cosmos. It is the ground of awareness itself. One of the biggest misunderstandings about the monad is that people imagine it as some ultimate object in the universe. Something divine, something cosmic, something hidden at the center of existence. But the monad is not a thing, because a thing requires boundaries. It requires separation. It requires something else that it is not. The monad has no boundary because there is nothing outside of it, which means the moment you try to imagine it as an object, you have already stepped away from it. The monad is not something you can see. It is that which makes seeing possible. It is not something you can think about. It is that which makes thoughts appear. Just like the screen behind a movie, the monad is never part of the story, but without it, the story cannot exist. If the monad is not a thing, then what is it? It is the totality appearing as multiplicity. Every star, every person, every atom, every moment of experience. All of it is the monad expressing itself through form. Imagine the ocean. Each wave looks separate. Each wave moves differently. Each wave has its own shape and lifespan. But every wave is still the ocean. The monad is the ocean of being, and every individual life is a wave arising within it. This is why the ancient mystics said something radical. You are not part of the whole. You are the whole appearing as a person. Not metaphorically, literally. So if the monad is the totality of existence, why does life feel so separate? Why do we feel like isolated individuals living inside a massive universe? Because the mind works by dividing reality. It labels. It categorizes. It draws boundaries where none actually exist. The moment a baby begins to develop language, the world becomes fragmented. Mama, Dada, tree, sky, body. But before those labels appeared, experience was already happening. Life was already flowing. Reality was already whole. The monad is that undivided reality before the mind slices it into pieces. The illusion is not that the world exists. The illusion is believing the divisions created by thought are ultimately real. Most spiritual traditions are built around a search, a path toward enlightenment, a journey toward truth, a process of becoming something higher. But when the monad is realized, something unexpected happens. The search collapses. Because the seeker was never separate from what they were looking for. Imagine someone searching the entire world for water while standing in the middle of the ocean. Every direction they swim only takes them deeper into what they already are surrounded by. That is the spiritual search. The moment the monad is seen clearly, the entire structure of seeking dissolves. Not because realization is achieved, but because the one who believed they needed to achieve it was part of the illusion. There is a simple way to glimpse this directly. Right now, before your next thought appears, something is already present. Awareness, being, existence itself. Thought comes and goes. Emotions come and go. Sensations come and go. But the fact that the experience is happening at all never disappears. That fundamental presence is not personal. It is not owned by a self. It is the same presence in every conscious being. That presence is what the monad refers to. Not a god in the sky, not an abstract principle, but the living ground of existence appearing right now. So when philosophers speak about the monad, they are not describing some distant cosmic mystery. They are pointing to the most immediate fact of existence, the one reality that never comes and never goes, the source from which every experience arises. And the truth is, you will never find the monad as an object, because you are not outside of it looking in. You are inside it. You are made of it. You are an expression of it. The moment this becomes clear, something profound happens. Life stops being a problem to solve and becomes an experience of the one exploring itself through countless forms. Most spiritual seekers spend years searching for truth. They meditate, read ancient texts, watch endless videos, and chase the next insight that promises enlightenment. Yet despite all of that effort, something still feels just out of reach. Not because the truth is hidden, but because the mind is searching for something that cannot be found. And nowhere is the misunderstanding clearer than in the way people talk about the monad. The monad is not a destination. It is not a mystical object. It is not a cosmic being somewhere in the universe. And it is definitely not something you can become. The truth is far stranger and far simpler. And once this misunderstanding collapses, the entire spiritual search begins to look very different. Across spiritual traditions, philosophy, and mysticism, the word monad appears again and again. The Pythagoreans spoke of it. The Neoplatonists described it as the source of all existence. Mystics referred to it as the One, the Absolute, or the divine ground. But over time, something subtle happened. Instead of pointing toward reality, the concept became another spiritual idea to chase. People began imagining the monad as something separate from themselves, a higher state, a cosmic unity to merge with, a final enlightenment waiting at the end of the path. But this assumption hides a critical mistake, because the monad is not something you move toward. It is what reality already is before the mind divides it. And until that is understood, the search itself becomes the very thing that keeps the truth hidden. The mind has one primary function. It divides reality into subjects and objects. There is the observer and the thing being observed. There is the seeker and the thing being sought. There is the spiritual practitioner and enlightenment waiting somewhere ahead. This structure works well for navigating the physical world, but when it comes to understanding the nature of existence itself, this mechanism creates a problem. Because the monad cannot be turned into an object. It cannot be seen. It cannot be measured. It cannot be reached. Why? Because the monad is the very ground from which the observer and the observed arise. Trying to find the monad as something separate is like a wave trying to find the ocean. The wave already is the ocean, appearing in motion. And the seeker is the monad, appearing as the act of seeking. The moment this becomes clear, the search begins to lose its urgency. Another reason seekers misunderstand the monad is because spirituality often becomes another identity. The spiritual ego says things like, I am evolving, I am becoming more conscious. I am getting closer to enlightenment. At first, these ideas seem positive, but hidden within them is the assumption that you are not already whole, that realization lies somewhere in the future, and this belief fuels endless seeking. But here's the paradox. The monad is not a result of spiritual progress. It is what exists before the idea of progress even appears. You cannot move closer to it. You cannot earn it. You cannot become it. Because the very awareness hearing these words right now is already arising within it. Realization is not a spiritual achievement. It is the collapse of the illusion that anything was missing in the first place. Another reason the monad is misunderstood is because language itself creates confusion. Language depends on distinctions. This versus that. Self versus world. Subject versus object. But the monad refers to something prior to all distinctions. So every attempt to describe it inevitably creates the illusion of separation again. For example, people may say, the monad is everything, but that still implies that there are many things that make up the whole. Others say, the monad is pure unity, but unity still suggests that multiple parts were combined. Even the phrase, the one, can be misleading, because the number one still belongs to a system of counting, and the monad is not a number. It is the reality in which numbers, thoughts, and concepts even appear. This is why many mystics eventually fall silent, not because there is nothing to say, but because words always arrive one step too late. Perhaps the biggest misunderstanding is the idea that the monad is something to realize later. People imagine that through meditation, studying, or awakening experiences, they will eventually arrive at it. But this belief quietly creates distance. It turns the monad into a future event, and as long as it is placed in the future, it remains out of reach. This is the trap many seekers fall into. They chase insight after insight, experience after experience, but the one thing they never question is the seeker itself. What if the one searching for the monad is simply another appearance within it? What if the distance between you and the monad is nothing more than a thought? And what if the moment that thought dissolves, nothing actually needs to happen? Because reality has never been separate from itself. The final reason people misunderstand the monad is because they expect realization to be dramatic. They expect a cosmic vision, a mystical explosion of light, a permanent state of bliss. And while powerful experiences can happen along the spiritual path, they are not the essence of realization. Because experiences come and go, the monad does not. Realization is often far simpler than people expect. It is the quiet recognition that nothing was ever outside the whole. The sounds around you, the thoughts in your mind, the sensations in your body, the awareness, noticing all of it. None of these exist separately. They are movements within the same indivisible reality. The mind may still think. The world may still appear divided, but something deeper is understood. The division was never real. Most spiritual seekers misunderstand the monad because they approach it in the same way they approach everything else, as something to understand, something to reach, something to become. But the monad is not another spiritual idea. It is not a higher level of consciousness. It is not waiting at the end of a path. It is the reality that was already present before the path began. And the moment this becomes clear, the search begins to soften. Not because truth has been found, but because it was never lost. Most people in spirituality believe they are getting closer to truth because they are learning more about it. More books, more teachings, more terminology. But when it comes to the monad, something strange happens. The more someone knows about it, the further away they often become from actually approaching it. Because the monad cannot be reached through knowledge, and that's where most seekers unknowingly go wrong. The word monad has become popular in spiritual and philosophical circles. People discuss it in terms of metaphysics, non-duality, theology, and ancient philosophy. It appears in the writings of mystics, Neoplatonists, and even modern consciousness studies. But there is a crucial distinction that very few people recognize. There is a massive difference between knowing about the monad and approaching it. Knowing about the monad is an activity of the mind. Approaching the monad is the quieting of the mind altogether. And once you see this difference clearly, your entire spiritual path begins to change. Let's begin. To know about something means the mind has formed a concept. The moment the mind hears the word monad, it begins constructing an idea. It imagines the source of reality, the absolute unity, the ultimate consciousness. But this is still just mental representation. The mind cannot help itself. Its nature is to interpret, categorize, and explain. So it builds an image of the monad, a beautiful image, a profound image, but still an image. And the moment an image exists, the mind has already created distance between itself and what it imagines. The knower stands here. The concept stands there. And the mind believes understanding the concept is the same as touching the truth. But the monad cannot be turned into an object of knowledge, because the moment it becomes an object, it is no longer the monad. Ironically, the spiritual seeker often becomes more separated from reality the more knowledge they accumulate. They begin to believe, I understand non-duality. I know what the monad is. I grasp ultimate reality. But this confidence is often just spiritualized thinking. The mind has simply decorated itself with higher concepts. It is still the same mind, still interpreting, still dividing, still standing apart from what it seeks. And this creates one of the biggest paradoxes of the spiritual path. The more you know, the harder it becomes to see. Because knowledge begins to function like a filter. Reality is no longer encountered directly. It is compared against what the mind believes it already understands. Approaching the monad does not mean gaining more information. It means losing the need to interpret reality. When the mind relaxes its constant labeling, when the inner commentary begins to quiet, when experience is no longer divided into observer and observed, something extraordinary begins to happen. Reality starts revealing itself without mediation. Not as a concept, not as a theory, but as direct presence. Approaching the monad is not about climbing a ladder of knowledge. It is about allowing the ladder to fall away entirely. Because the monad is not something the mind eventually understands. It is what remains when the mind stops trying to understand. This is why many of the greatest mystics spoke in paradox. They say things like, truth is beyond words. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The ultimate reality cannot be thought. These statements are not poetic exaggerations. They are precise observations. The mind works through distinction, but the monad is prior to distinction. Thought divides. The monad is indivisible. Thought creates distance. The monad is absolute immediacy. So the closer one comes to silence, not forced silence, but natural stillness, the closer one stands to what the monad actually is. The final shift happens when something very subtle begins to dissolve. The sense of being the one who knows. The mind no longer tries to grasp reality. It no longer tries to explain it. It no longer tries to possess it through understanding. Instead, there is simply awareness itself. Undivided, self-luminous, effortless. And in that moment, something extraordinary becomes obvious. The monad was never something to approach, because there was never distance from it to begin with. The mind created the illusion of distance. The silence reveals the absence of it. So the real question is not, how can I learn more about the monad? The deeper question becomes, what in me is constantly trying to turn reality into knowledge? Because the moment that movement slows, the moment interpretation relaxes, the moment awareness simply rests as itself, the difference between knowing about the monad and approaching it disappears. And what remains is something far more profound than understanding. Direct being. Every spiritual path promises awakening. But there is a moment when something far more important happens. Not awakening, but a shift. A shift that changes the direction of your entire life. And if that shift does not happen, realization never begins. Because the realization of the monad does not begin with effort. It begins with seeing something about yourself that you cannot unsee. And once that shift occurs, the old way of living becomes impossible. Most people assume spiritual realization begins when they start learning spiritual ideas. They read books, watch teachings, practice meditation. But the truth is much stranger than that. The realization process does not begin when you learn something new. It begins when the illusion of what you thought you were starts to crack. Not intellectually, but existentially. It begins when the identity you have been protecting your entire life begins to feel unstable. This is the inner shift that starts the realization process. And without it, all spirituality remains philosophy. Today, we're going to explore what this shift really is and why it changes everything. Let's begin. The realization process begins when you begin to question the story of who you are. Most people live inside a narrative. I am this kind of person. I have this personality. This is my life. The mind constantly tells a story about who you are and what your life means. And for most of your life, you believe that story. Not because it's true, but because it feels familiar. But something begins to change when realization starts. You begin to notice something unsettling. The story about you is being told inside your mind. And if it is being told inside your mind, then it cannot be the one who is aware of the mind. This realization is subtle, but it creates the first fracture in the illusion of identity. You begin to see that the person you thought you were might just be a narrative. Once the story begins to crack, another shift becomes possible. you start noticing your mind, your thoughts, your reactions, your emotions. Before realization begins, you are completely identified with these things. If anger appears, you believe you are angry. If fear appears, you believe that you are afraid. If thoughts appear, you believe they are you. But something begins to change. You start observing them. Thoughts appear, and you watch them. Emotions arise, and you notice them. The mind begins speaking, and you realize you are listening. And suddenly something strange becomes obvious. If you can observe the mind, then you cannot be the mind. This shift is extremely important because it opens the doorway to something deeper. The recognition that awareness exists prior to everything the mind produces. One of the biggest signs that realization has begun is this. The drive to become someone starts to weaken. Most of society runs on becoming. Become successful. Become enlightened. Become powerful. But once the realization process begins, this drive starts losing its grip. Not because you force it to disappear, but because something begins to feel off. You start seeing that the person you are trying to become is just another idea of the mind, another story, another identity, another mask. And suddenly, the entire project of self-improvement starts looking different. You begin to see something shocking. The seeker itself might be the illusion. And this realization changes everything, because it redirects attention away from becoming and toward being. When the story of the self weakens, something begins to appear. Curiosity. But not ordinary curiosity. Existential curiosity. A question begins to emerge in the background of your awareness. Not as a concept, but as a living inquiry. What am I, really? Not your personality, not your history, not your roles, but the one who is aware of all of those things. This question begins to change the way you look at reality. You begin observing everything more closely. Your thoughts, your reactions, your sense of self. And slowly, attention begins turning inward. Not toward ideas, but toward the source of awareness itself. This is where the realization process truly begins, because the monad is not discovered through belief. It is discovered through direct recognition of what you are. Something else begins to change during this process. Spiritual teaching stops being entertainment. Many people treat spirituality like information. New concepts, new philosophies, new frameworks. But once realization begins, that stops satisfying you, because concepts start feeling hollow. You realize something important. No idea can replace direct seeing. No belief can substitute realization. No philosophy can reveal the monad. This is when the real work begins. Not accumulating knowledge, but looking directly at experience. Watching the mind, observing identity, questioning the sense of self, and slowly, the illusion begins dissolving. The realization of the monad does not begin with enlightenment. It begins with a quiet shift inside of you. A shift that causes you to question what you thought you were. A shift that allows you to observe the mind instead of becoming trapped in it. A shift that weakens the endless drive to become someone. A shift that awakens curiosity about the one who is aware of all experience. This shift is subtle, but it is powerful. Because once it happens, you cannot return to the old way of seeing life. And from that moment forward, the realization process has already begun. Most people think spiritual realization will add something to their life. More peace, more clarity, more wisdom. But realizing the monad doesn't add something to your life. It changes the foundation your life stands on. Because the moment the monad begins to be realized, something very strange happens. The person you thought you were living as starts to feel less solid. The world you thought you were navigating starts to look less separate. And the search you thought would take a lifetime suddenly starts collapsing into something much simpler. Not because you figured something out, but because you finally saw what was already here. That is why realizing the monad changes everything. Not because it adds something new to reality, but because it removes the illusion you were living from. For thousands of years, mystics, philosophers, and spiritual traditions have pointed toward a single insight. Behind the endless variety of the world, behind every person, every object, every moment, there is one source, one reality, one indivisible ground of existence. This is what the monad points to. Not a God sitting somewhere in the sky, not a mystical idea you adopt as a belief, but the absolute unity behind all things. The monad is not something you join. It is what everything already is. But here's the problem. Most people only understand this intellectually. They like the idea of oneness. They repeat it. They quote it. They discuss it. But their perception of life is still built on separation. And as long as separation feels real, the deeper truth of the monad remains hidden. But when realization begins, everything starts shifting. Before the monad is realized, life revolves around a psychological center, the personal self. Everything is interpreted through that center. If someone criticizes you, the self feels attacked. If someone praises you, the self expands. If life goes wrong, the self feels threatened. This is the ordinary state of human consciousness, defending a self that is constantly trying to stabilize itself. But when the monad begins to be realized, something subtle happens. You start noticing that the identity you defend so fiercely is mostly constructed. It's memory. It's conditioning. It's a narrative. A story that keeps updating itself. And suddenly you begin sensing something deeper than that story. Something prior to the story. The awareness in which the story appears. This is the beginning of a radical shift. Because now the self is no longer the center of existence. It becomes something appearing inside existence. And that changes everything. Another thing that begins to change is how you see others. Before this realization, people feel fundamentally separate, which is why relationships become so complicated. People compete, they compare, they defend themselves. But when the monad begins to be realized, something becomes obvious. The same awareness looking through your eyes is the same awareness appearing through countless forms. Different personalities, different histories, different expressions, but the same source. This doesn't mean everyone behaves consciously. Far from it. But it changes how you perceive the human drama. You begin seeing people less as enemies and more as expressions of the same life moving through different conditioning. And that softens something inside of you. It's not weakness. It's clarity. One of the biggest changes happens in how suffering operates. Pain still exists. Loss still exists. Uncertainty still exists. Realizing the monad doesn't magically remove life's intensity. But what begins to dissolve is the personal interpretation of every experience. Normally, when something painful happens, the mind immediately says, "Why is this happening to me?" But when the illusion of separation weakens, the experience changes. Pain is still pain, but the psychological resistance begins to relax. Instead of every experience becoming a personal crisis, life begins to flow more directly. Moments are allowed to exist without being turned into identity. And the strange thing is, a huge amount of suffering disappears right there. Because most suffering isn't pain. It's the mind fighting reality. Another dramatic shift happens in your relationship to becoming. Most people live as though fulfillment is somewhere in the future. So the mind spends years chasing a better version of itself. But when the monad begins to be realized, this entire structure starts falling apart. Because you begin to see something simple. What you were searching for is the very ground of your being. The awareness you were hoping to reach is the awareness you are already living through. And suddenly the chase loses urgency. This doesn't make you passive. You still act. You still create. You still build and grow. But now your actions are no longer driven by a sense of inner lack. They arise from something much quieter, something complete. The final shift is subtle but powerful. The world itself begins to feel different. Before realization, the universe appears fragmented. Separate objects, separate lives, separate events colliding randomly. But as the monad becomes clearer, reality starts revealing a deeper continuity. Life begins to feel more like a single living process. A field, a movement, a unified unfolding. And ordinary moments become strangely luminous. Silence feels deeper. Nature feels alive. Conversations feel more intimate. Presence itself becomes meaningful. Nothing has changed externally, but the way reality is perceived has shifted. And once that shift begins, it becomes very difficult to go back to the old illusion. So why does realizing the monad change everything? Because it removes the illusion that you are a separate fragment trying to survive in a disconnected universe. It reveals that the life moving through you and the life moving through everything is the same source appearing in infinite forms. You don't become the monad. You are the monad. And the moment that realization begins to dawn, life stops being a desperate search for completion and becomes the unfolding of something that was already whole. If this journey spoke to you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone ready to experience life beyond thought. Comment below. When did you first begin questioning the idea that you are separate from reality? I read every comment. If you would like to support my work directly, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/magnumopus333. Or you can explore some original merchandise at my Teespring store online. The link is in the description below. Remember, your consciousness is the key that unlocks reality. Let's keep unlocking it together. Thank you for watching. Until next time.